Moral or character complexity does not have to be complicated. The most obvious idea behind moral complexity is that looking at a character or faction, you can see a multifaceted ideology or morality. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare. It can be something as simple as a faction's leader ordering something done they believe is absolutely necessary and being somber or withdrawn about it. Because they don't enjoy what they're doing, perhaps even finding it horrifying, but they are doing so because they believe in a certain cause. People aren't cardboard cutouts. If you write them without any complexity to their ideology, especially in an RPG, you have either screwed up or are not writing someone who should be a major character. If several iterations of the Power Rangers can be morally or even emotionally complex, there is no excuse for the factions in a full-on RPG to be overly simple, unless a simple faction was the entire point. But with two exceptions, I don't believe that to be the case in Fallout 4. Now, normally when I make these videos, I'll have the how to fix section after going over everything else. However, each faction that needs fixing is going to need fixing in different ways. So I'm going to go over a faction's general problems, then immediately how to fix that faction, then rinse and repeat. While I'm not an experienced sci-fi or fantasy writer, I'm going to do my best to come up with a decent scenario for each faction that needs overhauling. Hopefully it'll still be interesting to y'all. Let's start with the first exception so we can get out of the way. The Commonwealth Minutemen. The current Minutemen, in general, are a failure as a faction, at least in terms of writing and world building. The previous incarnation of said faction sounds frankly far more interesting, which is the real problem here. The previous Minutemen had intergroup politics, infighting, and seemingly a succession line for the generals in case something happened to them. The rebuilt Minutemen have a general, a grumpy old quartermaster, Preston, and then just rank-and-file troops. Recruiting into the Minutemen happens as you help settlements, even if said settlements only had 2 or 3 inhabitants. There is no part of the Minutemen quest where you have to actually go to major population centers and start a recruitment drive, or anything similar. Your personality, morals, and ability to negotiate are completely unused within this faction's story. There is no moral complexity within the rebuilt Minutemen because there is no complexity to their questline, period. Go to a settlement and help people. Repeat until you have a few allies. Retake the castle, wait for Grumpy to show up, and then build artillery. Then on to the stuff that happens for all non-institute factions. That's pretty much it. You don't even need to organize or train your new forces, and there's no hard or even interesting choices to be made. The Minutemen have no complexity as a faction. This was either intentional, because they are the default faction, or just sheer laziness on the writer's part. And since Emil is Bethesda's head writer, I personally believe it was likely his fault. That, or Todd rushing everything. Especially considering a bunch of people willing to dress up like Revolutionary-era soldiers in a high-tech post-apocalyptic wasteland, who are also able to, at least in theory, fight really well, should not be boring. To be honest, the Minutemen do not really need moral complexity so much as they need a more in-depth questline. They are supposed to be the outright good guys, but still, they are very flat. The best fix I can think of, outside of a full-on rewrite, is actually rather simple. It would even imply some moral complexity. As the general of the Minutemen, you should have to make some very hard decisions. Say early during the questline, you have to choose to help a smaller, minimally armed settlement, or a larger, more heavily armed settlement. There wouldn't be enough time to help both. If you help the smaller settlement, the larger one is damaged, maybe even losing some people, maybe a merchant or other service person. If you help the larger one, everything would seem fine. The settlement even agrees to support the Minutemen with crops and occasional ammo shipments. However, the next time you visit the smaller settlement, the sight that greets you is akin to the ending of the Girl Worth Fighting scene in Mulan. Just charred dead bodies and ruins along with an outright cut-off of music when you're within the general area of said settlement. An eerie silence, along with maybe finding something like 2 dead bodies clinging to each other. or a larger body hunched over a smaller one in a protective but ineffective attempt to save them. Whichever you choose, you could even have Preston comfort the player by telling them in that situation there were always going to be losses. Especially with their current limited numbers, and that's why they're striving to rebuild the Minutemen. The more people lending aid, the more of those types of situations that can be averted. A general, especially in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, should have to make hard choices, and those choices should have consequences. They should also learn from those decisions what the consequences of not building up a formidable force are. Adding things like this to the Minutemen questline could make them feel more morally complex, and frankly, more engaging in general. As for the scenario I went over being potentially too dark, if we weren't ready for darker storytelling, we wouldn't be playing Fallout in the first place. Especially when you consider what the Raiders like to use for decorations. Oh yeah, one last thing about the Minutemen. When you blow up the Pridwin, Preston should be horrified, especially if he's been on board and seen the actual children living there. Now, the second exception is Raiders. There are no truly nuanced Raider gangs, at least in the Commonwealth. They are all just different flavors of effed up. There are a few individual Raiders who have some nuance to them, but they are not in any way a reflection of Raiders in general. All Raiders are thieves, murderers, or worse. Even if, later on in life, some of them stop being those things. Raiders don't really need fixing. They are the fodder bad guys of Fallout. They're not supposed to be morally complex, they're supposed to be mostly irredeemable monsters. And while something as simple as a few still images could prove this fact, I'm not sure Overboss algorithm would like me showing those, so moving on. All aboard! Let's talk about the railroad. These folk are more or less shown to be straight-up good guys. Stupid good guys, but good guys nonetheless. Seriously, that damn password. Even Preston, the bloody saint that he is, says they don't sound too bad, freeing sense and all. The railroad in general take a hardline stance against what they perceive as slavery. Whether they're correct or not depends on if the synths they're rescuing are actually sentient. Which, in my opinion, depends entirely on the generation of the synth in question, since the later generation synths appear to simply be kind of full-on lab-grown clones, making them basically human. And early generations are just more humanoid robots. However, ironically, even if none of the synths they liberate are actually sentient, what they are doing is still a net positive by depriving a very dangerous group of mostly evil mad scientists of useful resources. You could argue it's only a drop in the bucket, but if that were really the case, the Institute likely wouldn't be so obsessed with recovering runaway synths. Although I do have a few theories about that. Maybe another time. All that being said, the Railroad is depicted as outright good guys. They only strike against another non-Institute faction if that faction has attacked them first. And with the exception of an actual lunatic and a habitual liar, they're not actually happy or sad about doing so. The Railroad are not morally complex, they are simple good guys. The Railroad would actually be fairly easy to make more morally complex and somewhat more interesting. You could simply have them act in a more ruthless fashion in regards to saving synths. This could take the form of the Railroad finding out that the Bunker Hill merchants are Institute informants and ordering you to deal with them. This more brutal Railroad would see these people as complicit in slavery, which would cause them to give you carte blanche to handle the situation in whatever way you deem necessary. If you happen to decide scorched earth is necessary, Pam would say it was the most efficient method, Glory would be congratulatory, Dr. D-Bag would be annoyed by the possible problems it could cause down the road, Desdemona would ask if there really wasn't another way, Drummer Boy would be horrified, and Tom would still be trying to inadvertently blow us all up. If you decided on a more subtle approach, the other agents would be mostly relieved. Except Glory, who was all gung-ho to deal with the scumbag slavers, and Pam, who will state that she needs to recalculate for the potential complications leaving the merchants alive would cause. Even a single mission like this would allow the player to see some nuance within this rather simple faction. Now, on to the Brotherhood of Stealing Your Crops. In the previous 3D Fallout games, these folk were morally and idealistically complex. But not anymore. I swear, Arthur Maxon is the worst thing to ever happen to this iteration of the Brotherhood, and that is saying a lot. There are a few members of this Brotherhood who are morally or idealistically at odds with the so-called Elder. However, not many, and they're certainly not major players for the most part. It does seem, in the game, that some people had problems with the way the Brotherhood was run by Maxon, but changed their tune over time. This Brotherhood, by and large, takes a hardline and bigoted stance against anything that by their standards is non-human, including non-feral sentient ghouls, synths, and supermutants, even the few friendly supermutants. They will also take whatever they want from anyone weaker than them. This includes, but is in no way limited to, coercing a settlement into giving them their food and allowing said settlers to starve, and ordering the death of a completely loyal member based on the circumstances of their birth. They are also willing to commit a small-scale genocide against a faction that, as far as they know, poses no threat to them, based entirely on their bigotry and hardline beliefs. With a few small exceptions, these people in general are outright villains. There is no moral complexity here, only bigotry and a weird version of technophobia, often used as an excuse to do whatever they want, including some pretty terrible things. So how to fix this version of the Brotherhood, at least from a moral complexity standpoint? Let's start with Elder Manbaby himself. This character basically needs a whole rewrite. However, this isn't the video for that. Arthur Maxon is one of, if not the worst faction leaders I have seen in a Bethesda game, and Hannibal Travin was from a Bethesda game. Now, in the game, almost everyone in the Brotherhood seems to be in awe of him. Yeah, a bunch of hardcore military lifers seeing someone both younger than them and frankly rather hot-headed and arrogant are not likely to be in awe of that person, regardless of that person's accomplishments. So why not lean into an internal Brotherhood conflict? Maybe start by having a few of the Pridwin Brotherhood be either at odds with or even outright disgusted by his unprofessional attitude and outbursts. Instead of this almost cult-like environment, you could have the members slowly over the course of the questline become more disillusioned with this supposedly amazing leader. Eventually, his more unnecessarily extreme orders, even by Brotherhood standards, would be too much and lead to a challenge to his authority backed by a decent number of the higher-ups and opposed by others. A one-on-one duel that the player, or far more likely, Dance would have to win to claim elderhood of this branch of the Brotherhood. This would require the player to pass a series of absurdly hard speech checks with Dance, considering Maxon was basically his best friend. But friend or not, the well-being of the Brotherhood as a whole comes before that. If that duel ending sounds familiar, well, the cutting room floor is a really depressing place, isn't it? This would show that the Brotherhood as a whole is capable of being divided from within based on their morals and ideas, making them seem more human overall. I honestly still don't actually know why the Institute does most of the things they do in this game. However, one thing I do know is that Sean himself is an outright supervillain. Even through the BS he spews, you can tell he does the things he does simply because he wants to. There is no nuance here. He's basically just curious, and to him that means he has the right to do any horrific thing to satisfy that curiosity. And for the most part, the rest of the Institute scientists are the same way. Seemingly, only Virgil had a problem with some of what they were doing. He would also have rather turned himself into a supermutant and run away than actually try to change or challenge the Institute. This tells us exactly how short a lifespan he would have had if he had tried any harder to change things than he did. The Institute is also responsible for Swan, turning some poor fool into that monster because he stole a pack of cigarettes. Not valuable equipment or dangerous chemicals, just cigarettes. Talk about an unproportional punishment. These people are by and large simply evil at best, and incompetent and evil at worst. Despite the attempted facade of benevolence, there is once again no real moral complexity here. Okay, within the game, Sean is outright a dictator. Even the other department heads have no real authority within the Institute. This frankly makes moral complexity nearly impossible, because how do you show multiple viewpoints when only one voice really matters? So the obvious fix is to keep Sean as the head, but lessen his overall authority. Have the other department heads be willing to challenge him on things openly. Each one could have a different viewpoint on what's best for both the Institute and the world in general. And have the department heads utilize a voting system for decisions that would impact multiple departments. If Sean wants you to be the next head honcho, that's fine as long as you're willing to earn it. Have part of the Institute questline be about helping each department head, and maybe for higher intelligence characters, impressing them with your well-developed mind. By the time Sean is announcing you as his successor, you should have met each head and learned about their work and done something important or dangerous for them. This would allow the player to learn how each different head in the Institute views things and understand they all have different priorities, and sometimes vastly different views on morality. Have one head see the people outside in the Commonwealth as little more than lab rats or even lesser, and have another view them with pity for what he or she sees as horrible living conditions. Have yet another view them as uneducated children who need proper schooling. These aren't really positive viewpoints, but as elitist super scientists, their views aren't supposed to be positive or negative. They're supposed to be cold and calculating, backed by human personalities, or at least so they think. It would be interesting to be able to convince one or more their views on the Commonwealth folk are being influenced by their own personal bias. Maybe be able to steer the Institute in one direction or another based on how well you've earned their trust. Going so far as to convince them that the people of the Commonwealth either need saving, destroying, or gentle guidance from the shadows. None of this would make them the good guys, but it would make them more than one-note bad guys. The Gunners almost work from a moral or narrative complexity standpoint. I'm gonna have to explain this one. First of all, a lot of their initiates wind up having regrets about joining. This alone tells me that many different kinds of people join their ranks. And they were not fully aware of what being Gunner scum meant. And yet, you deal with the vast majority of Gunners you meet in the same exact way. The Gunners, as shown through gameplay, are basically just wannabe tyrants. Even their unwillingness to shoot a fleeing opponent, or them warning people off from an area before engaging, is not done out of some mercy or moral code. It's made very clear it's to prevent the waste of ammunition on non-threats. Gunners, as a faction, are just greedy mercenaries, and despite some very odd behavior by their higher-ups, this doesn't change the more you interact with them. The Gunners are another faction that honestly do not need moral or narrative complexity. The greatest mistake with the Gunners is that you can't join or hire them at all. To be blunt, they are mercenaries, and while individuals who join might have some moral complexity or nuance, if they do, they don't really show up in the game except for McCready. The best way I can think of to fix the Gunners from a narrative perspective would likely to be to stop them from being so trigger-happy and make them a little smarter in general. When you, someone the Gunners might as well think is a random scavenger, go after the Courser chip, you walk into a Gunner-held area and are immediately attacked. Yeah, what the actual hell are they thinking here? As far as they know, their real threat is the Courser, and instead of dealing with that, a fairly large chunk of their forces are trying to end you. They should either be outright ignoring you, or more likely, strong-arming you into fighting on their side against the invisible replicant. Once the Courser is dealt with and you have the chip, have the Gunner leader there tell you to leave because this is Gunner territory. And have the Gunners actually let you leave peacefully as long as you're out of their building within a certain time limit. This would make them seem like reasonable people, at least to an extent, and reinforce that no-wasting ammo ideology. It would also lead to you having to make the moral choice of fighting the Gunners to save the synth girl or just leaving. Just leaving would likely cause problems with the railroad if you were a member at the time. You could also meet gunners in the Commonwealth who have varying personalities to drive home they're not all just single-minded thugs. So yeah, no real complexity needed on this one, just a need to make the faction as a whole a little less dumb. The Mechanist is basically just a good-hearted, socially awkward girl who immensely screws up. When she says she didn't realize what was happening with the Robo-Brains, I believe her, but this does mean she's just a well-meaning screw-up. She feels guilty about the Robo-Brain thing, but that's just natural for a good person in general. So there is no real character or narrative complexity here, just a good person. How to fix Isabel Cruz, aka the Mechanist. I honestly don't believe she needs real fixing, but that is likely because I enjoyed Automatron quite a bit. This doesn't mean we can't flesh her out, though. Well, like I said, in the game, she's simply a good person that screws up badly. The biggest problem here isn't meeting her and talking her down, it's what comes afterwards, which is nothing. She gives you continuous Radiant quests, possibly hinting at the sheer level of her screw-up, but that's it. She doesn't develop after that. It would have made sense for meeting her to be the halfway point of the DLC story, not the ending. Have her become either a proper quest giver or a companion. As a quest giver, she would send you on a series of recovery missions to find useful tech or information to make the robot army idea safer, culminating in having friendly robot patrols across the wasteland, maybe even having something akin to the Minutemen flare gun to call nearby robots to your aid. Each time she sends you on one of these missions, she would tell you a little more about her past and reveal more personality outside of the crippling social anxiety. As a companion, she would slowly come out of her shell and gain more real-world experience to understand how the Robo-Brain idea failed so miserably. After all, there are other Robo-Brains out there, and not all of them lose their damn minds. Have her come to understand just how much damage she did, and grow as a person and come out of her shell little by little because of it. Keep her a good guy, just make her a truly guilt-ridden tragic one. Maybe one who sees the suffering and death they've caused as some kind of debt to be paid to society, which becomes the reason she wants to find a safer alternative to the Robo-Brains. Have the second half of the questline be about an unknowing villain rising like a phoenix into a true hero. Next up, the Nuka World factions. The Nuka World Raiders are just more raiders. As such, they are just a few more flavors of effed up. Porter Gage has a sympathetic backstory, but is not a good person. He is every bit as complicit, if not more so, in the mass murder during the fall of Nuka Town as any other raider there. And frankly, he's basically the only raider there that is in any way fleshed out. The rest are just tougher raiders with a different paint job, so there is no moral or narrative complexity within any of the Nuka World Raider factions. Fixing the Nuka Raiders. Well, we don't. They're raiders. Considering their crimes, making them morally complex would be kind of ridiculous. Not impossible, but ridiculous. They're all just straight-up monsters. Moving on. The Hubologists. Despite being a parody of an arguably despicable group of unknown people, the Hubologists are a well-meaning group who come off as scammers, but frankly in universe, probably aren't. There is actual evidence in the game to suggest there is at least a little more to their beliefs than just a small-scale mass delusion. The Nuka World Hubologists are basically really odd, neutralish, mostly peaceful good guys, even if they are really weird. Fixing the Hubologists. No, I am not screwing with this faction's writing. They are too damn funny, which makes me believe they were hidden from Emil until it was too late for him to mess them up. Moving on. Okay, on to the Far Harbor factions. The native citizens of Far Harbor are for the most part bigoted, violently inclined idiots. It's no wonder old Longfellow wants to live alone, away from these people. Only Dima's little project keeps them from being slavering attack dogs. Once again, some of them are more nuanced, but as a whole, they are aggressive idiots. Emphasis on the idiots part. With the citizens of Far Harbor, I can honestly only suggest making them smarter. Let's try to push their collective intelligence up from angry chihuahua to at least blue healer. Even something as simple as a small but influential group who are hardlined against unnecessary conflict could help balance it out from a moral perspective. And no, Avery doesn't count. She is literally an unknowing body double with a severely altered personality, which somebody should have really noticed sooner, but like I said, these people are really dumb. Speaking of which, the idea that no one would help out around the harbor because it's not their land or place is really, really dumb. No group in this situation that wants to survive for any length of time would be this monumentally stupid. Especially a group that knows exactly how dangerous the island really is. It doesn't add any kind of real character to the setting, it just makes everyone involved in said tradition look like fools. So yeah, drop that, make them a little smarter, and have the townsfolk all have varying opinions on possible conflict with other factions. Acadia. Holy hell, where do I start with this faction? Well, I guess the vacuum tube head honcho will work. Dima is not morally complex or benevolent. He is a villain painted in sympathetic colors. When he can't think of a way to negotiate peace with Far Harbor, he kidnaps a woman and outright murders her to replace her with a copy. And he had to effectively kill the synth that he used to make the copy as well. When he can't think of a way to negotiate peace with the Children of Adam, well, he has a password that would let him outright nuke their base. The only interesting or complex thing about Dima is that he is self-aware enough of his own flaws to wipe his memory of the events. But that's not really moral complexity, it's cowardice at best, and a complete lack of personal responsibility at worst. If doing these things was so repulsive to him as an individual, then he would have never done them. To me, at least, Dima comes off on the surface as a version of Sean capable of feeling remorse. But to be blunt, it's laid on so thick, I'm not entirely convinced he's genuine about said remorse. Some subtlety can go a long way in a story. The other two founders of Acadia honestly have little effect on the story, so I won't be bothering with them except to say they probably should have had a bigger role from a story perspective. Kasumi is just a confused girl. Whether she's a synth or human, she is shown to be just that. A scared and confused young woman who isn't sure where she belongs. Do you know what that's called? Being a teenager. Probably made even worse by the whole post-apocalyptic wasteland thing. So, Acadia as a whole is a bunch of fairly peaceful folk who just want to be left alone, led by a secretly very terrible person. He is such a terrible person, he even keeps it a secret from himself. If I believed for a second he thought what he was doing was necessary, and then felt horrible guilt over it to the point he couldn't live with the knowledge, then I would call that somewhat morally complex. But I don't believe him. I think this whole thing was a tactical decision, although that might just be me. Fixing Acadia. Well, first of all, if Acadia is going to have 3 founders, they should all have at least some significant effect on the faction's questline. Second, and this is going to sound a little weird, but make it clear pretty much right off the bat that Kasumi is outright human. Hear me out on this one. Having your character figure out Kasumi is just a confused human girl would make Dima seem more fallible much earlier on. It could even be revealed this isn't the first time something like this has happened. And yet Dima continues to call out to people who have even the barest suspicion that they might be synths, potentially endangering everyone in Acadia, because to him, any chance that a synth could suffer what he went through is too much for him to accept. This could then lead into the whole offing and replacing Avery and finding the boom key for the nucleus backstory. Having Dima do what he does for an understandable reason rather than just machine smarter than man would go a long way towards fleshing this faction's morality out. And as the questline progresses, have Kasumi, who now knows she's human, be indecisive about whether she wants to leave or not, because the people here have been extremely welcoming and supportive, and her father could be a bit much at times. So you need to convince her one way or the other. Oh, And I probably shouldn't need to say this, but we should just drop the whole Dima trying to convince you you're a synth thing outright. That was just Bethesda's writers running face first into a wall of fan theories. Fan theories they likely didn't understand or care about. And lastly, make Dima's grief and guilt a little more subtle. As he comes off as a badly acting stage performer at best. It comes off as suspicious. The children of Adam in the nucleus are religious zealots. While a few of them are not openly hostile to outsiders, the majority are very hostile to non-followers. This is most heavily embodied in the insanely violent tendencies of High Confessor Tectus. The man is frankly a complete and total warmonger. His first and seemingly only real idea to deal with the other factions of Far Harbor is cleanse the unbelievers. Yeah, these people are mostly villains painted in cult colors. So villains. It's kind of sad we didn't get Martin as High Confessor and Tectus as a close and more aggressive advisor to him. That could have been interesting. Fixing the radiation-worshipping wackos. Like I hinted at a few seconds ago, let's have Martin as High Confessor, someone who is willing to listen to reason, but still carries an absurdly deep faith in what he believes in. And have Tectus as his aggressive, warmongering advisor or second-in-command. Maybe even have Tectus go behind his back to antagonize the other factions, especially Far Harbor. Martin and Tectus would be two extremes, and you could meet several members within the nucleus who are more moderate, and maybe a few who lean further towards one extreme or the other. Some would want to maintain peace, some full-on war with the heretics, and a few would actually want to achieve personal division. Having it set up this way would give us a more expansive moral complexity than just the in-game's almost entirely violent group of religious zealots. Maybe have to decide based on getting to know these people which leader's better for them in the long run, and making sure that happens. I do hope I've demonstrated that achieving moral or narrative complexity for a lot of the game's factions wouldn't actually be all that difficult, at least from a writing perspective, and frankly, neither is fleshing out a character. You know the depressing thing about Bethesda games is, I'm certain there are mods to fix most of the minor mechanical or even game-breaking bugs. Even mods to give factions their own perk trees and new companions almost certainly exist. But from my limited understanding, mods to fix the already implemented factions' storylines themselves would be difficult, if not nearly impossible to implement. You would have to revoice characters, alter the way some of the factions interact with the world and the people in it altogether, and worst of all, you would have to implement a full story for the faction you're altering in a way that didn't interfere with anything else important. Well, actually, I don't believe it would be truly impossible, just absurdly time-consuming and labor-intensive. And let's be honest, most of the modders who are gloriously crazy enough to do something like that are already working on projects none of us would want them abandoning for my flights of fancy. By the 9, I am so looking forward to Skyblivion and Fallout London. Still, I do think looking at things like this and seeing how we can improve them is a rather fun exercise. An exercise Pagliarulo has likely never done. You know, just like he's never done basic PR training. Holy crap, he made himself look bad there. Although, my enjoyment of these things might just be because I practically live to overthink things. Oh well. Well, I think I've talked enough for now, so I'll just say, thank you for listening to my inane ramblings.